Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Armstrong Television's program called Chapters. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in the tri-state area, including West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Carter Seaton, and I'm delighted that you're with us today, and I'm even more delighted to welcome distinguished author Lee Martin. Lee is the author of the novels The Bright Forever, a finalist at the 2006 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, and that's the picture that you see behind him. River of Heaven, Quakertown, Break the Skin, and Late One Night. He's also published 3 memoirs in addition to a craft book on writing. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in many prestigious journals and magazines, and he's the winner of many coveted writing awards. He also teaches at the MFA program at the Ohio State University, where he's a College of Arts and Sciences distinguished professor. Lee, we're so glad you're here. It's a real treat. This is not your first visit, though. I think you were here when Elliot Parker was the host of the program. So welcome back.
Thank you, Carter. It's a pleasure, and thank you for inviting me to visit with you.
Today, we want to talk about your newest book called Yours, Jean. It's a great read. I just zipped through it. It was just fascinating. Couldn't put it down. So give us a little synopsis of that book.
Well, the book is based upon a true story that took place in my native southeastern Illinois, very close to where I grew up. In 1952, on the first day of school, the high school librarian was murdered inside the high school by her former fiance, who had come to try to convince her to take his ring back and resume the engagement. He said later, when she refused, "What, I had that gun, what else was I to do?" And then he blamed it all on what he called that blasted romance. So that was the starting point for the book. This was a story that I had heard when I was growing up in that part of the world. And the story actually got sensationalized. There were many reports of ghostly activities taking place in the high school. People outside the school, for instance, seeing a light pass from one room to another room as if it were passing through a wall, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so part of the reason I wanted to write the book was I wanted to desensationalize that story and to humanize it. So I started with the premise of this young woman. In the novel, her name is Jean DeBelle, who comes to Lawrenceville, Illinois with her first teaching position, and she's also the school librarian at Lawrenceville High School. And she rents a room from an English teacher named Mary Ellen McVeigh. And as the novel opens, Jean is very excited about starting this new life away from her former fiance. And she doesn't know that he is 11 miles away in a hotel room, about to make his way to Lawrenceville High School to try to convince her to resume the engagement. So the novel actually focuses upon a series of characters who have some sort of attachment to either Jean or her former fiance, Charlie Camplain. And I follow each of these characters' storylines as they are affected by the crime, the murder that takes place in the high school that day.
Yeah, when you first introduced Charlie, he gave me the creeps. He was just kind of a character that just didn't seem quite rational, I guess. And the remark that you made that what was I to do? I had the gun is completely irrational. So
right.
I think you've taken that line and made a character around that certainly is complex and holds our attention. And once he does what he does, he seems to become a more minor part of the book, and the other characters take over. So I wondered if you consider him the protagonist, or if you call this a book that has no central protagonist.
Well, I guess I consider it a novel that has a number of protagonists because, as I say, each person has his or her own story. So, for instance, the hotel clerk that checked Charlie out that morning, the cab driver who took him to Lawrenceville, Mary Ellen, who rents the room to Jean, Mary Ellen's daughter, Robbie. All of these people have their own stories to tell. And I'm really interested in the way that the murder has some sort of bearing upon each of those storylines. I will say that when I started forming the character of Charlie Camplain, I started with a photograph of the real murderer, whose first name was actually also Charlie. I changed his last name for the sake of the book. But the photograph of him was right after he had been arrested, and he's standing between the sheriff and a police officer, and he's got his hands on his hips and he's got his jaw jutted out, and he's just looking cocky as everything. And that's where I began with this character, and that's why he is so darn creepy, because he's just got that attitude, which I describe in the book, I think, as being sort of an undeserved confidence. Mm-hmm. But on the other side of that, I have to say, in Charlie's defense, even though he is completely creepy, completely irrational, I make an attempt to try to understand where that comes from in his past. And one thing we find out is that he has nerve damage in an ear because he was in an artillery unit in the Army. And he's lost a lot of his hearing. And he's gone back to college on the GI Bill. And he lives in a rooming house with traditionally aged college boys. And they're always sort of ostracizing him, making fun of him. But he happens to sit next to this lovely girl named Jean DeBelle in an English literature class. And he's just fascinated with her. And one night he runs across her on campus, and she's obviously distraught over something. And she's so embarrassed that she runs away from him. And then the next day in class, she gives him a note offering to explain if he would like to meet her at the campus pond that evening. And she signs the note, "Yours, Jean." And when I was writing the book, Carter, I was well into it, and I had no idea what the title was going to be. And I told my wife, Kathy, I said, I don't know what to call this book. So she started reading through the manuscript, and one night I was in my study, she was in her office, and all of a sudden I heard her shout out, "Yours, Jean." Oh, that's not too bad. It's the signature on the note. But I like titles that have a literal place, but also a more figurative place. And in this novel, Jean's death stays with all of these people forever and ever, and so she'll always be theirs. Yeah. So that's why I titled it what I did.
Right. That I love it when a title that's just perfect comes to you. That's great. That same idea of one event changing the trajectory of everybody's lives around you. Have you used that in more than one novel?
I think that's my go-to.
Yeah.
I have. I mean, like The Bride Forever, for instance, it's the abduction of a young girl that reverberates through the various populations of the community. So yeah, I've used that before. In that book, it was a lot of first-person narrators telling their own story. These are third-person narratives in Yours, Jean.
But it rings so true. It is true in life that if one, it's like the butterfly effect, I think. One thing happens and it does reverberate, particularly through a fairly small community, but in almost any city, it will make a difference in a lot of people's lives.
Well, that was another thing I was going to say. Most of my novels are set in small towns in the Midwest. And I think it's really true in that setting that anything that happens in the community really affects all populations of that community.
Right. So the other thing I noticed that was so wonderful in this book was the seamless way that you've used the backstory to inform the happenings on the page. it's, like you said about Charlie, you've explained what his background is to give him, some sympathy. You want your protagonist to have, even if he's a cad, so to speak, you want him to have some reason that the reader sympathizes with him. And you've done that. You've done that with Mary Ellen. You've done that with the taxi driver and with the clerk. Everybody's got a backstory, and you're able to weave that through what's happening to them now to explain how they act. And I tell us a little bit about that kind of technique. You've used that before, I'm sure, too.
Right. I tend to think of backstory as being important to our understanding of our characters' behaviors and what I like to call the dramatic present of the novel. But I don't want to do what we sometimes call a backstory dump with just a long section of backstory. So what I try to do is I try to give the reader the information from the backstory that the reader needs at the moment the reader needs it. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the backstory gets chopped up into various sections that get woven through the dramatic present of the novel.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the section where Jean is thinking about whether she's done the right thing, breaking off this engagement, that just naturally invites the story of how they first met.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And the backstory of Mary Ellen, whose husband had died, and how she doesn't have a very good relationship with her daughter, the one of the taxi driver and his child, and how that interacts with the football hero. All of those are just done so beautifully. I really enjoyed this book.
Oh, thank you so much.
I read that you have an extensive collection of wind-up toys. Have any of them ever made it into a novel?
I'd really have to think about that. I can't think of any wind-up toys that appear in any of my novels. I also have an extensive collection of really corny jokes, and some of those make it into the novels. But I can't think of a wind-up toy in a novel.
Well, maybe you need to consider that the next time around. And I noticed that you've got a fairly long resume of jobs before you became a writer and a professor. Have you ever used the background from some of those in your books?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah, I went through a lot of manual labor jobs before I got on the academic path. And that's the world of work is really useful to a writer.
Sure.
Characters have to have something to do, and I'm always interested in sort of jobs that you wouldn't necessarily think about. I got to tell you, Carter, to survive this pandemic, I've been watching old reruns of a game show called What's My Line?
I remember that show very well.
And this is where people would come on and the celebrity panel would try to guess by asking yes or no questions what the person did for a line of work. And it's really a reminder to writers that our characters can have some really interesting jobs.
And they can't all be English professors, can
That's
they?
right. Or working cubicles.
Yeah, right, exactly. What did start you down the academic path and into writing?
Well, when I was first out of high school, I thought I wanted to be a journalist. Then I came to understand that meant I was going to have to go out and talk to people, and I didn't really want to go out and talk to people. And that's when I started taking creative writing classes, and I just fell in love with storytelling. And so then I remember I was in an undergraduate creative writing class, and it was being taught by a man who had gotten his MFA from the famed Iowa Writers Workshop. And that was the first time I was aware that there was something called an MFA and that you could actually go to study to be a writer, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I wanted to do. After I got out of college, I had a job that I worked for 3 years before I finally got up the nerve to apply for an MFA program. And that's what really started me down the path. I wanted to be a writer, and I also wanted to teach. That was very important to me. I didn't have any of these grand illusions that I would only be a writer and support myself that way. My mother was a grade school teacher. All my life, I wanted to do something with teaching and communication, and so it just happened to become creative writing.
That's great. That's great. Do you have a favorite author that you have constantly thought about in terms of your own writing?
I have a number of them, Carter, but the one that really rises to the top is Richard Ford. I remember his first collection of short stories, a book called Rock Springs. I remember reading that and hearing something in the voice of the narrators that opened up my material to me. Like most young writers, I made the mistake of thinking that no one would have any interest in my small towns and farming communities from the Midwest. And then I read those stories by Richard Ford, and even though they were taking place in the American West, those first-person narrators were speaking in a way that the people I knew best spoke. And it sort of gave me permission to tell the stories that I knew best. And so Ford is always a go-to influence for me.
Do you like that format of telling things in the first person?
Oh, I do, but it's not exclusively. It's interesting that you bring that up because I'm preparing a craft lecture right now about first person narration, and I'm noting how popular it is with writers. So I want to be able to talk about it in a way that will be helpful to them. But I think we do ourselves a disservice if we think first person is the only way to tell a story.
Right. You're also a memoirist. Tell us about the 3 memoirs you've written. Were they each of those in a specific time in your life?
Well, the first memoir I wrote is a book called From Our House. I had published a collection of short stories called The Least You Need to Know, and most of those stories were narrated by sons in difficult relationships with fathers. And they were actually just a sort of a scrim through which I was telling my story and my father's story. And I got my first tenure track teaching job at the University of North Texas. And the first class they wanted me to teach was a creative nonfiction workshop. And I thought, wow, if I'm going to teach somebody how to do this, maybe I better try to do it. So I wrote a little essay called From Our House. It was the very first time I had written directly about my father, who was a farmer who lost both of his hands in a corn picker when I was a little over a year old. Became an angry man. We had a difficult relationship as I grew up. And I wrote this little essay. And the next thing I knew, I wrote another essay and another and another. And then I just gave in, I surrendered, and I became a memoirist. And so I wrote this book called From Our House, and it's about my father and me, his accident, et cetera, et cetera. I thought I was sort of done with nonfiction at that point, but then in the meantime, I started doing all this genealogy research into my father's side of the family, and I started finding out things I'd never known. And so the next thing I knew, I'd written another book of nonfiction called Turning Bones, which is sort of an unearthing of ancestors that I never knew. And then the third book is a book called Such a Life. And that's actually a memoir in individual essays that hits upon some of the same things the other 2 books do, but also some more contemporary parts of my life. And then I actually have another memoir coming out next year. And that's called Gone the Hard Road. And that's a book that features my mother and the life that she made possible for me.
Do you like that form of doing memoir, or do you prefer the fiction?
No, I like both, Carter. I always say that whenever I have a material that seems important for me to claim as my own, for instance, the story of my father's accident, and I like writing that in nonfiction. It's a way of going back over experience and thinking about what it all means and trying to get a deeper understanding of the people involved, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I like going back and forth between fiction and nonfiction.
That's good. That's interesting. Do you have a specific writing regime?
Oh, I'd like to say yes, 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 I do.
Yeah, so would I.
Yeah, everyone always says, "Well, yeah, I write 4 hours a day or whatever. This time." The truth is, I'm a morning writer. I'm no good this time of day or beyond. And so my regular practice is to get up in the morning and go for a run or a walk and then write. It's not possible to do that every day. I just finished the draft of a new novel, and it came at a good time because now I've got lots of other things to turn my attention to. So I'll just let that manuscript sit there and cool off, and I'll forget it, and then I'll come back to it with fresh eyes. So anyway, I try to write in the mornings. In the summer, I can do that fairly well. But when teaching duties come along, then it becomes hard.
Do you tend to then write on the weekends instead of during the week?
Carter, I used to write 7 days a week if I could. But my wife, Kathy, has given me so much joy that I like to spend the weekends with her.
Smart man. Smart man.
Well, as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that it's okay to let off the gas a little bit and to just rest and have time for your family, etc.
I've been following you on Facebook, and I've noticed that you've got posts in a blog that are kind of writing advice. Are they parts of what you do in the MFA program? Are they things that you've told your students? Or I'll be interested in the first person narrative thing. I hope you put that in a blog someplace.
I think I've actually done 2 posts about the first person narration the past 2 weeks, I believe. Yeah, these are things that some of them are things that come up in the writing workshops I teach, and then doing the blog gives me a chance to think a little more deeply about them. Some of them come from questions that people pose to me, whether students or not students. When I started that blog, I didn't want to do it. I had hired a new web designer, and he said, "You got to have a blog." And I said, "I don't want a blog." He said, "No, you got to have a blog." So I really started it screaming and kicking. But I think that was 12 years ago, and I really enjoy doing it.
Yeah, that's good. How long have you been teaching in the MFA program?
Let's see, I started in 2001, so 19 years.
Wow, that's a long time. Do you find that the students, I don't know quite how to put this, but maybe are they more sophisticated in their writing now than they were back then, or has that changed their style of writing?
I see definite changes in the styles of writing. I'm sorry?
To what do you attribute that?
Well, I think it's attributed to more diversity in publishing, in the sense of the diversity of genre, diversity of form. I see a lot of students who are interested in what we used to call postmodern type of writing, retellings of fairy tales, it's so hard to say that word, post-apocalyptic fiction. It's kind of surreal fiction. I sometimes worry about realism and what's happening to it. But I do think there's a difference in the students' interest in form and style. I think talent-wise, it's pretty much been consistent over the time I've been here.
Do you find that they're avid readers these days?
They do. They read.
I-
They read so much. It's hard for me to keep up with what they read.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, they really do. Now I'm talking about the MFA students.
Yes. I read a statistic the other day, and I can't quote it exactly, but it said something to the effect that because of the diversity of the ways in which people can read now, that students are doing more reading with things like the ebook and the, Audible and things like that. If and I call that reading. So
Sure.
maybe that's made a difference, the technology.
Yeah, I think that's true. It certainly has. And I think you see that represented in the publishing industry as well.
Mhm.
There are so many more options for publishing these days than there used to be.
Yeah. Does that give your students encouragement that they may be able to get published? I know everybody aspires to having a big six publisher and so forth, but the reality is we're not all going to get that. And if they know that they can even self-publish if they want to, as long as they've gotten a good editor, does that give them encouragement to keep on writing?
I think it probably does. Although I try to downplay publication for my MFA students because I think sometimes they start to worry about it during the process of writing.
Ah,
I tell them that you really shouldn't worry about it until you've got something that you think is worthwhile publishing.
mhm.
So in other words, I'm a big believer in the process leading to the end result. And
Mhm.
so I don't want them to be obsessing, as Charlie Champlain may have, over telling a story and getting it published. I want them to really be concentrating on the craft.
Right, I understand. What appeals to you in other writers that you read?
Carter, I'm always interested in writers who are looking at what we might call the mysteries of the human heart.
Mhm.
Um, I think it was William Faulkner in his Nobel acceptance speech who referred to the old verities and truths of the heart. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in writers who are willing to look at the complications of human beings, how we interact with one another, how we interact with ourselves, how we interact with the world around us. I want to read something that sweeps me along in a narrative, but at the same time, I want it to show me something about what it is to be alive on this earth.
Mhm. That's a great way of looking at it. Do you have a favorite of your books? Everybody has, it's probably, I've heard a lot of people say, well, it's the one I'm writing on now or the one I just published, but do you have a favorite of all of yours?
Well, I mean, I have to say that The Bright Forever has a very fond place in my heart. And that first memoir, From Our House, I'm very fond of it as well.
Mhm.
So I'd say those two books really stand out for me. Now, if you ask Kathy that question, she would have a completely different answer. She likes my book Break the Skin quite a bit.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, for me, it's The Bright Forever and From Our House that'll always stand out for me, I think.
That must have been a real thrill to have been a finalist as a Pulitzer Prize winner.
Well, it was a big surprise, I can tell you that. I didn't even know that my publisher had nominated me for it. And then to find out that I was a finalist, which means that I was one of three books. Geraldine Brooks's novel March won the Pulitzer that year, and then E.L. Doctorow's book The March
Mm.
was the other finalist. And so I've jokingly said if I had only titled my book The Bright March Forever, I would have won just on word count. But but to be one of three, yeah, that meant a good deal to me.
Oh, I'm sure it did. What are you working on right now?
Well, Carter, it's interesting that you asked that question. I just finished the first draft of a sequel to The Bright Forever.
Ah,
Now, I don't know if this will ever see the light of day. I'm not sure. It's too early to know. But at the end of The Bright Forever, one of the main characters sort of drives off into the sunset, so to speak, leaves this little town tries to leave behind what's happened there. And I've always wondered where he went and what happened to him after he arrived. And so I just finished the draft of what I'll call a sequel to that book.
That's great. Well, we look forward to that and whatever comes next in your prolific writing life. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lee. It's been wonderful, even if it had to be on Zoom instead of in person.
Well, thank you so much, Carter. It's a pleasure.
We hope to return to live interviews soon, but in the meantime, stay well, stay tuned for the next episode of Chapters, and stay tuned to Armstrong Television for the news and views that impact you and your community.
Connect with Chapters through email. Write to lp4@zoominternet.net. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, share, and comment. All Chapters episodes are available on YouTube. Visit the Armstrong Neighborhood channel on YouTube and look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.